everybody. Thank you all for coming. I think some more people will be joining us, so we're just gonna get started with a little bit of housekeeping. My name is Racine. I'm the outreach coordinator here at the library, and want to thank you for joining us for this virtual talk with Dr. Emily Channell Justice on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just a heads up, we are filming this discussion for our archive. So if you don't want to be on camera, that's fine. Just be aware that during the Q&A, you may appear. And if you want to watch this later, you can do that on our website. Make sure that you're on mute.
This is supposed to make it right.
Thank you. Make sure you're on mute during the talk. We just want to make sure that we don't get any feedback. And if you want to change your view to, I believe it's speaker view, that will make it so the person who is talking is the one who's taking up most of the screen. And then after the presentation, like I said, we'll be doing a short Q&A, and we'd ask that during that time to use the little raised hand icon or reaction, just so we know who has a question. You can also write your question in the chat. We can save them that way, and then I can field them to Dr. Channell Justice. So we'll get started. Dr. Emily Channell Justice is the director of the Termerdi Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. She is a sociocultural and anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. She has pursued research on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013-2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center, City University of New York in September of 2016. And she was a Havikhurst Fellow and visiting assistant professor of international studies at Miami University, Ohio, from 2016 to 2019. Please, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Emily Channell Justice.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks to everybody for being here. And thanks for accommodating my schedule and shifting to Zoom. It's wonderful to see some of your faces. And I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight. So here we go. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. These are some images taken by Dmytro Kozatsky, who is one of the soldiers who was held in Russian captivity from Mariupol. We recently were able to publish many of those on our website, so I thought I would just feature those for the beginning of the talk. So thanks again for being here. And again, I think it's just so important to continue to talk about Ukraine. So thanks to everybody who's able to continue to pay attention. I know there's a lot going on everywhere. So of course, the war in Ukraine is now going into the 4th month. The war began on February 24th. According to the official estimates from the United Nations, 4,889 civilians have been killed in this war thus far, including hundreds of children, but we can guess that the true number is really much higher. Official counts also state that there are 8 million refugees from Ukraine. Most of them crossed Ukraine's western border to European Union countries, and there are 7 million people within Ukraine who have been forced to leave their homes. The Ukrainian armed forces claim that over 35,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the past 4 months. This could be an exaggeration, but the United States has claimed last month that Russia lost about 25% of its combat power that it originally used in the invasion. So this 35,000 figure could be quite accurate. Even the Russian government has admitted that its soldiers are dying in Ukraine, although it restricts access and it certainly to information about soldiers' deaths, and it certainly won't admit that 35,000 troops have died. So how did we get to here? What is this invasion about, and why does it matter? Russia, and especially Russian President Vladimir Putin, claims that Ukraine is not a country, and indeed Ukraine has been part of different institutions such as the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, going all the way back into the 17th century. This territory was part of the Soviet Union. It was known as the Second Soviet Republic because it was so important within the Soviet Union. So when the Russian Revolution started in 1917, and the Bolshevik government under Vladimir Lenin was forming in Russia, this territory decided to try to expand to take over Ukraine, to include Ukraine in the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union was officially established in 1922, the eastern territories of Ukraine, so this side, the eastern side of the river that breaks the country in half, those were incorporated into the Soviet Union. However, Ukraine also has many examples throughout its history of declaring an independent country and claiming independence or unity for the territory that you see on the map, which is a map of modern day Ukraine. So when the Russian Revolution was happening, before the Soviet Union was founded in 1922, several different groups of political actors had this idea that Ukraine should be an independent country. And in 1918, a group of them were able to declare the Ukrainian People's Republic, which was around the exact amount of territory that you see on this map, so similar to modern day Ukraine. And this territory was had Ukrainian national identity, they had their own currency, they had national symbols, and it also incorporated a diverse group of political actors with lots of different political perspectives. And in fact, it was a very contentious time period for what was happening in Ukraine. Unfortunately, the Bolsheviks were able to overpower this Ukrainian People's Republic and its political figures. And so Ukraine began to be incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1922. But that was only part of the territories, and the western part of Ukraine, as far west as what is now the border with contemporary Poland, those parts of the territory didn't get integrated into the Soviet Union until 1945. And one of the important historical moments in the 20th century that helped Russia make its claims over the territory of Ukraine was the Stalin's created famine, which is known as the Holodomor, which was happening in 1932 and 1933. This famine was intentionally designed to weed out the Ukrainian intellectual classes and to weed out Ukrainian national actors. Many of them were imprisoned or killed, in addition to this famine that starved people all across the Eastern Territory. And when so historians tend to agree today that some 4 million people were killed in this famine, although estimates actually go all the way up to 10 million people. We can't actually know the exact number of people who were killed in the famine because the Soviet Union covered it up not only when it was happening, but for many years afterward as well. So we really don't know how many people were killed, but in this Eastern region, many Russians were moved into the territory after it was vacated by Ukrainians, and that's one of the reasons there's so many Russian speakers there today. But it was this a really important moment in the Soviet Union establishing this strong control over Ukraine, rooting out its intellectual and artistic classes, and crushing any kind of nationalistic or independent spirit, making it easier to take over the rest of the territory, although national groups were fighting for Ukraine's independence in Western Ukraine up through the 1950s. So for a long time, Ukraine was officially part of the Soviet Union, but that doesn't mean there wasn't opposition to that. And there were always people who were fighting against the Soviet rule. And that is true up until 1991, which is when Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union. This is a map of all the regions of Ukraine, where you can see that every single region of Ukraine voted for independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. So obviously in Western Ukraine, you can see that independence was supported by a vast majority of people. But even in the territories of Eastern Ukraine, these are the territories where today Vladimir Putin claims that Russian speakers need to be protected by Russia itself. So even in these regions that are the ones that are mainly being fought over at this exact moment, people supported independence from the Soviet Union. And even in the territory of Crimea, which is at the bottom, you can see that a majority of people, only a slight majority, but still a majority, supported Ukraine's independence as well. So the population of Ukraine is around 44 million, or at least it was up until February 24th, and it is the largest country entirely geographically in Europe. It's around the size of Texas, so it's quite a large country. And since 1991, Ukraine has been working hard to establish a democracy with the intended goal of eventually becoming part of the European Union and other institutions, including NATO. That's one that we have heard about a lot. Vladimir Putin has been claiming since he wrote this long essay last summer that Ukraine and Russia are the same, that they're brothers. But despite that, obviously, Ukraine has shown since its independence in 1991 that it wants a different direction. So you can see here that obviously Ukraine has had 5 different presidents since 2000. Leonid Kuchma is the first one in 2000. He was the only president who served 2 terms in Ukraine. And every president since then has only served 1 term. You'll recognize Volodymyr Zelensky, the TV comedian who was elected president in 2019, and who's now representing Ukraine on the world stage in a way that is largely is very highly approved by not only Ukrainians but most of us around the world. Obviously, in Russia, the trajectory looks a little bit different. Vladimir Putin, who's in the middle there, came to power in 1999 at the end of the year, and he's been president every year except for this period from 2008 to 2012. Dmitry Medvedev was the president. Putin served as prime minister, but in actuality, he had all the power behind the scenes. And of course, he has recently changed the Russian constitution to enable himself to be president up until 2036, which he was supposed to only be able to serve 2 terms, but he's obviously made that possible for him to keep going. And then at the bottom, I just wanted to include Alexander Lukashenko, who is the president of Belarus, Russia's greatest ally. He's been president since Belarus was independent. He hasn't even pretended to let anybody else be in power. So you can understand perhaps why these 2 guys are such important collaborators. But the point of this time period, the past 30 years in Ukraine is, despite lots of domestic disagreement about Ukraine's future direction, a lot of infighting with different political groups, the fact of the matter is Ukraine has become increasingly democratic since its independence. It's an imperfect democracy, to be sure, but that democracy is what people want. This has been definitively true at least since 2014. That's when the Euromaidan protests took place. That was when my research was taking place as well. This is a photo that I took at those protests in December of 2013. So Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president at that time, was supposed to sign an association agreement, which was an economic agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. At the last minute, he decided not to sign it. He decided he would turn Ukraine back toward Russia, re-enter an economic union with Russia. People came out into the streets. They said that they didn't support that. They wanted Ukraine to be part of Europe. And so ultimately, these protests, first they began to be about Europe, but they continued throughout the winter of 2013 and 2014. And ultimately, they became about removing Yanukovych from power because he no longer represented the people who had elected him. And a violent uprising in February 2014 resulted in 100 protesters being killed by riot police and snipers. But ultimately, those protests succeeded. Yanukovych fled the country. He's currently in Russia, actually helping Vladimir Putin out with this war. But Ukraine, since these protests ended, there were elections when the protests were over. And since those elections in 2014, Ukraine has really been working hard to establish functioning democratic institutions. So certainly peaceful transfers of power from one president to another. They've been working really hard on judicial reform as well. And of course, on economic reform, bringing Ukraine's economy up to European standards so that Ukraine can be part of the European Union. But the point being, despite the fact that there's still a lot of ideas about what democracy in Ukraine should look like, the main thing that people agree on is that they want to live in a democracy, and they will fight for that if they have to. So how did Vladimir Putin respond when Ukrainians in 2014 definitively broke away from Russia and showed that they wanted to be part of Europe? Well, he invaded several parts of the Ukrainian territory. First, at the end of February 2014, Russian troops invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which you can see in red at the bottom. This was a relatively peaceful invasion where, no bloodshed, but troops entered the peninsula. And then a few weeks later, Russia held a referendum so that people in Crimea could vote to become part of Russia. That referendum vote is largely considered not to have been legitimate. Many different groups who opposed the Russian takeover were prevented from voting. That includes groups like the Crimean Tatars, which is the indigenous population of the peninsula, who have been very politically active and have always supported the unification of Crimea with the mainland of Ukraine. Most of them were either boycotted or were prevented from voting. So the takeover of Crimea was one of those moments in 2014 where the response from the Western allies of Ukraine was not very aggressive. There were some light sanctions that were placed on Russia, but unfortunately that kind of emboldened other actors to try to take control of other parts of Ukraine. So what you can see here in the eastern part of Ukraine, these two red territories, so these are the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, and separatist groups in both of those regions decided they would also like to be part of Russia. So they took over some of the main cities there. There was an uprising that included Russian troops and Russian military support to help those separatist groups. And then the Ukrainian military responded, starting the war that went on from 2014 until February of 2022. You can see from this map, and the map points out that was about 7% of the Ukrainian territory that was under Russian occupation when the second invasion happened in February of 2014. And it's important to remember that when that invasion happened, when Russia took over those parts of the Ukrainian territory, Ukraine was neutral at that time. Ukraine was not part of the European Union. It was not part of NATO, and it really actually wasn't, it was officially had some agreements with those institutions, but it wasn't really on a clear path to join either of those groups. And so when Vladimir Putin claims often that NATO expansion is what provoked him to invade Ukraine, he already invaded Ukraine in 2014 when NATO expansion was not even part of the discussion. So you can tell that is a sort of made up excuse to make these claims on Ukraine. But it's important to remember that the war in Ukraine really started in 2014. It was ongoing up until the new invasion began in February of 2022. Soldiers were dying every day, although it was really easy to be in Ukraine and not even really know that there was a war going on in the East. It was pretty far away for a lot of people. And it had established kind of a status quo of existing with the war that had become kind of accepted in Ukraine. So this NATO question, like I mentioned, was not really on the table in 2014, but obviously now we're talking about NATO again rather a lot. And I think that the shift in Ukrainian public opinion about NATO is really interesting. So some colleagues of mine have been doing a survey that includes a question about if people in Ukraine want to join NATO. And that number, they have been doing this survey with the same question since 2014. And so you can see in the image on the right-hand side that the number of people in Ukraine who support Ukraine joining NATO has increased dramatically since 2014, but especially dramatically since 2019. You can see a strong uptick at the end of the line there, and a downtick, if you will, of people who don't support Ukraine joining NATO. And what they have also pointed out is that this is true. This is a majority across all regions of Ukraine as of 2019. And that's a really dramatic shift that people were starting to be interested in joining NATO, especially far before this invasion actually happened. However, I hosted a conference in February, just a few weeks before the invasion happened, and it included a dozen scholars of Ukraine who all agreed that Ukraine was at least 10 years away from joining NATO, based on NATO's expectations of what would have to happen for Ukraine to be accepted into that group. So while Ukraine had sort of turned into this interest in NATO, it was still very distant. It was more supported than ever, but it wasn't really a close future development. And you can see on this map on the left-hand side, also Georgia on the bottom here as another potential future NATO country. I mean, you can understand that NATO expansion eastward did in fact happen, but certainly the Baltic countries were some of the first post-Soviet countries to join, and then Poland and Czech Republic and Slovakia as well. And then now we can also color in Finland and Sweden as new countries that are now interested in joining NATO that weren't before. So I think in reality, we can conclude that, you know, rather than NATO expansion really provoking Russia to need to defend itself, Russian invasion of Ukraine has provoked other countries to have a new interest in joining NATO, because they can understand that it's beneficial to them to have that kind of security mechanism to protect them. So this is a map of the current situation of the war in Ukraine. This map is dated today. And as you might recall, when the invasion first began at the end of February, Russian troops were attempting to come into Ukraine all across the northern part of the territory. They had attempted to come into Kyiv here, the capital city. They got quite far down. They occupied some of the cities and villages in the northern part of Ukraine, of Kyiv here. And of course, there have been airstrikes, missiles all across the country. But they were unable to easily take over the capital. They have been pushed back by the Ukrainian forces. And so the fighting has really been concentrated in the eastern part of the country and in the southern part of the country. So just to clarify the colors here, the purple territories are the territories that were occupied up until the invasion, so from 2014 to end of February 2022. And then the red regions are the regions that have been occupied by Russian troops since February 24th of 2022. And these pink areas are the ones that Russia has expanded into recently, or they're the ones that are the hottest spots of fighting right now. So right now, the Ukrainian military is focused on trying to prevent Russia from moving further into these two eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. This is where the fiercest fighting is. Unfortunately, Ukraine is losing over 100 soldiers a day in these regions as well. The fighting is quite severe. Russia has largely occupied these cities in the southern part of Ukraine. Obviously, Mariupol is the city that I mentioned at the beginning. That's a city that has been completely destroyed. 100% of the buildings have been destroyed in that city, and it's completely uninhabitable. I read a figure that up to 22,000 civilians might have been killed in Mariupol, and we just really don't know because of the Russian occupation now. The Ukrainian forces are quite active here around Kherson, which is a place that is currently occupied by Russian forces. But there's a pretty fierce resistance among the Ukrainian civilian population in that city. And the Ukrainian military has been making some gains in that area, trying to protect cities to the west, like Mykolaiv and Odessa. So the Ukrainian military has held rather strong here in the south, a lot of fighting in the east. And like I mentioned, there's kind of every single day, there's some sort of rocket attack or missile strike somewhere across the country, small towns, large towns. Obviously, Russia has hit cities in Western Ukraine as well, including Lviv, which is where many people have gone. So there's always this reminder that nowhere is really safe, even if most of the fighting has been concentrated in the east and the south. So there's a lot of questions of where do we go from here, and what is the future of this conflict? How long will it go on? I want to take the time to talk a little bit about the humanitarian impact, because certainly the movement of people, the displacement of people has just been unprecedented really in the modern era. This map is also from today. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs does a really excellent map of movement and of the humanitarian situation. So the red is missile strikes that have happened in the past several days. So again, you can see that they're really concentrated in specific parts of the country, especially in eastern Ukraine, but also in Kharkiv at the top here, and exactly at that front of where Russian troops have occupied southern Ukraine. There's also a lot of missile strikes happening there too. So this UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs claims the following figures. 8 million refugees from Ukraine. So that's people who have gone mostly west. As you can see, the numbers in Poland are close to 4.5 million people. Just over 500,000 people have gone to Moldova and Slovakia. You've got almost 1 million people going to Hungary and 736,000 in Romania. This is the number 1.4 million that the UN office gives for people who have gotten to Russia. This number, I'm not really sure exactly who they're counting. Certainly there were many Ukrainians when the war started who had pro-Russian sympathies, who decided to go to Russia because they thought it would be safer. However, Russia has also forcibly deported many people from the territories that it currently occupies in eastern and southern Ukraine. So personally, I don't really trust any figure that's released by the Russian government. So I'm not really sure if this number is an actual accurate account of how many people Russia has forcibly deported or not. And I don't know how we'll get to know that number. But this is the number, that has been claimed. As far as the numbers of refugees go, it's also a kind of difficult number to assess because the number of 8 million that's being counted as the number of refugees actually is discounting the number of people who have crossed the border to get out of Ukraine since February 24th. So that means that any person who has crossed the border since February 24th has been counted in that 8 million number. So that includes people who have crossed multiple times. That's 8 million people. It's not without subtracting the number of people who have returned. Right now, the estimate is that 2.8 million people of that 8 million people who have left, 2.8 million have returned. So again, that means 2.8 million people have crossed back across the border to Ukraine. But the problem is we just don't really know exactly how many people have left and where they're staying. So in Poland, the most recent figures that I have say that 3.5 million people have asked for temporary protection. Excuse me, that is not just in Poland, that's everywhere in Europe. So 3.5 million people have asked for temporary protection. So that means that people have asked for a specific status that recognizes that they are a refugee from Ukraine. The number in Poland is actually closer to 1 million who have asked for that special status. So that leaves millions of people who we don't really know where they are. They might have gone to Poland for some time and then decided to go somewhere else. They might have gone to Poland and then gone back to Ukraine, right? And people are moving multiple times. So perhaps people go to Poland to get out of Ukraine immediately. I know one family from Mariupol who was able to get out of the city. They all ended up in Warsaw, then they ended up in Denmark. And just today they were awarded green cards in Canada. So everybody is moving a lot, and it's really difficult to assess what people's needs are when people are moving so much. At the same time, people largely really want to return. So one of the reasons that many people don't want to take that temporary protection status where they ask to be recognized as refugees is because they hope they'll be going home soon. So they don't want to have any reason to be in a country for any longer than they have to. And I think that this is something that makes it really difficult to count people because, like I said, they're moving all the time. So the other important figure to think about here as we're talking about displacement is that the UN also estimates around 7 million people who have been internally displaced. So that means that people who, this is people who have moved from one place in Ukraine to another place in Ukraine. And so this has largely been concentrated to people from the east who have moved toward the west, whether it's to Kyiv in the center or further west than that, or to some of the territories in the southwest here that are also very far from the front lines. And again, that number of 7 million people, we're not sure exactly what that tells us. So one of the things that is similar to the question about temporary status, there's also an official status within Ukraine of internally displaced person. You have to register for that status. So 7 million internally displaced people, that's the number of people who have registered, but that might not include everybody because maybe not everybody registers. But the other problem here is that we're using this term internally displaced, but in reality, a lot of people are homeless. A lot of people's houses have been entirely destroyed. A lot of people simply can't access their homes anymore because roads, infrastructure have been destroyed. There is widespread mining. So people, it might just be not safe to go back to one's home because there are mines. Ukrainian forces are trying to demine different areas, but it's difficult and it's slow work. So we know that overall most people hope that they can return to their homes as soon as possible, but it's hard to say, do they have a home to go to? Is it safe for them to go home? And in addition to that, maybe their house is okay, but is there a hospital nearby, for example? Healthcare facilities have been targeted by Russian missile strikes across the country. Schools have been targeted. So maybe it's possible to live in your home, but are there other institutions that you need, like schools, hospitals, food supplies, gas, etc. Whether or not people have these available to them is an open question. And I'll just talk a little, I was recently in Warsaw for a couple of weeks, where I was able to do some volunteer work in some humanitarian initiatives. And again, like I said, we don't know all of the numbers, but for Poland, the Polish government lifted a lot of restrictions to cross the international border. So Ukrainians were allowed to cross the border from Ukraine to Poland without an international passport if they didn't have one. And Poland lifted all of their COVID restrictions as well. So you didn't have to have a negative COVID test across the border. And those are two reasons that so many Ukrainians went to Poland. So at the main train station in Warsaw, which is where I took these pictures, there is a lot of information. There's an information desk. There's medical care that you can have. There's information about where you might find a job or where you might find housing. And the World Central Kitchen, which is an American NGO, has a hot food tent where every hour of every day, Ukrainian refugees can come and eat a hot meal. And as far as I know, this tent still exists. This is the last that I heard, is that it's still there, it's still working. However, the Polish government has taken away some of the helpful policies that it created in order to help Ukrainians. So for example, for the first few months of the war, Ukrainian refugees were allowed to use public transportation for free all around Poland. And at the beginning of June, they were no longer allowed to use public transportation for free. And the Polish government was also paying Ukrainians and paying Polish people who were hosting Ukrainians in their homes. They were giving them a cash payment to help support the Polish people who were helping Ukrainians. And those cash payments have ended as of July 1st. So the changing resources that are available to Ukrainians will certainly change how long people are interested in staying in Poland. It'll change, how long Polish people are interested in supporting Ukrainians, which is another question. And those are, like I said, they're changing a lot, and unfortunately, they're changing despite the fact that the need hasn't gone away. The other place that I was able to work in Warsaw was a free shop that was run by mostly Polish people. So it was in this building that you can see on the bottom right. It was this film group that rented this space, and they gave out free groceries, which you can see on the left, and donated clothes. You can see on the right, they just gave whatever people needed, they gave it away. And this was a really interesting, almost all of the volunteers who worked in this shop were Polish people who had full-time jobs, no background in humanitarian work. They just wanted to help out. And so they all volunteered their time to come to the shop, not only to, give out groceries and clothes on the days that the shop was open, but they would sometimes come on the days off and help organize things, help organize donations. And at that shop, it was a combination of Polish people and some Ukrainians who were themselves refugees who decided that they really wanted to help other refugees. And so they wanted this opportunity to help. Again, this shop closed at the end of June. The people who organized it had been prepared for that. They lost the space that they had. So they decided to take all of their donations and send them to the border to help people who are waiting at the border and give out those groceries, hopefully get some of that food into Ukraine. And then they decided that they would focus on other kinds of initiatives to help people in the longer term. So organizing Polish language classes, for example, for Ukrainian refugees. So people still want to help. Polish people, I think, have not exhausted their interest in helping, but it has become harder over the past 4 months to be able to help. It's really difficult to sustain that kind of energy. And especially when the Polish government is, changing its policy all the time. And also when so many Ukrainian refugees are going back home, if they can, it becomes really difficult to sustain these kind of initiatives. So that's the current situation in Poland. Obviously, it's important to continue to think about how we can help from here. Obviously, donations are always really helpful. The World Central Kitchen, not only are they working in Warsaw, but they actually work in Ukraine. And they do an amazing job because they contract out to local chefs in Ukraine. So they're not sending their own people all the time. They're paying people who are already in Ukraine, who already have resources, already have spaces. And that's why they're able to be on the ground so quickly. So if you're unsure where to donate, I highly recommend the World Central Kitchen for all the work that they do around the world. Ukraine Forward is a local volunteer organization that has been organizing a variety of things, including humanitarian aid that's going to Ukraine. And finally, if you would like, you can actually directly send money to the Ukrainian Armed Forces through the Come Back Alive organization, which is, just, I think, a cool way that Ukraine is using technology to do everything they can to support their military. Obviously, Ukrainians are still asking for US military aid. So I have continued to ask my representatives to support sending more military aid to Ukraine. That's the thing that helps people the most. Not only does it help the Ukrainian troops fight against Russian invaders, but it helps them protect the civilians who are still under threat all the time. So as many people have said to me, as many Ukrainians I know have said to me, your humanitarian aid is good in theory, but it can't really help us as long as the war is still going on. As long as the Russian threat is still there, civilians will still continue to be harmed as long as Russia is allowed to fight Ukraine at all. So anything that can help Ukraine end the war more quickly is helpful. And finally, reading and sharing verified information is always a way that you can help. It's something that's really easy. It doesn't seem like a huge effort for us to do that. But it's really important to push back against misinformation about Ukraine. But it's also important that we help keep Ukraine in people's minds because the war is still going on. So I really recommend the Kyiv Independent. It's a news organization that's online. It was formed, it's totally crowd-funded, so it's not beholden to any big entity. And it's all journalists largely based in Ukraine, and it's all in English. And then our Ukrainian Research Institute here at Harvard also has an excellent resource page that we've put together over the past 4 months that includes links to expert interviews and expert presentations, as well as, like I said, the photos that I mentioned, and some other resources to learn a little bit more about Ukraine. So I will go ahead and stop here. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I am happy to take your questions.
Yeah, so if you have a question, you can use in the reaction bar. There's a raise hand option, and I'm happy to call on you and take the question, or feel free to write something in the chat. Oh, I have a Carl So has a question. You can unmute yourself if you'd like.
So did you say Carlos Molina?
Oh, it looks like it says Carl So that's why. But
Oh.
yes, you.
Yes,
Thank you.
great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the presentation, Dr. Channell Justice. First of all, what Putin is doing in Ukraine is absolutely abominable. But there are a couple of things that I'd like to raise. One, I mean, my own humble opinion, I know that you asked for donations and supported that, but it seems to me that there are only two options that how all this will evolve. Number one, either the US engages in diplomacy, or millions and millions of people in Ukraine are going to die. They're going to be continuously destroyed, and they're going to be annihilated. That's my humble opinion. It's going to go nowhere. Now, the concern that I have is that there is no diplomacy. Biden has been out there saying that, even to the point that Putin should be removed. Number one, how would we react if the president of Mexico said that Biden should be removed? Number two, how would the US react if it got into some kind of agreement with China? And I'm concerned that the way I interpret it, maybe that's not how you meant it, Dr. Justice, but you just in passing mentioned the expansion of NATO eastward. That was an agreement that was done once, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it was not eastward meant not an inch east of Germany. And we know you shared with us what NATO has done. Can you imagine what the US would have done if there was some kind of comparable agreement with Mexico right on our border? Again, I'm not condoning in any shape or form Putin's reaction. What he's doing is really horrific. However, unless the US engages in some real diplomacy, we're going to see, number one, the annihilation of Ukraine. And the other thing that no one really talks about is the possibility of nuclear war. I have no idea why no one is even discussing that. So I'm wondering, Dr. Channell Justice, if you would comment on some of my remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there's a couple of, so I'll start with the diplomacy question. My real problem with diplomatic solutions is that Russia is a bad actor. Russia is a bad faith actor. Vladimir Putin has made many promises in the past, and he made promises up until this invasion that he would not use further force in Ukraine. And here we are 4 months later, unable to find any other option, because he breaks all the promises that he makes. So I think it's really difficult to advocate for a diplomatic solution when one of the people who will have to be involved is not going to hold to that solution. And we know that because he has given us all kinds of examples of him not adhering to those promises. And the other problem is of course in Ukraine, there has been some examples of European governments advocating for Ukraine to make concessions, territorial concessions, give up part of their territory to Russia in order to find a peaceful solution. And I would just say two things to that. First of all, the most recent polling data showed something like 85% of Ukrainians don't support any territorial concessions. And so that means that President Zelensky cannot in good conscience give up those territories when he knows that the majority of people in Ukraine don't support it. And he has said as much. He has said that he will not go against the people's opinion on this one. And frankly, in addition to that, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. Who's to say that some kind of diplomatic negotiation and agreement will actually stop further conflict? Because I don't believe that it will. I think that the most likely scenario, if there's a diplomatic arrangement, is that Putin will sit on that arrangement for another couple of years. Let's not forget he's in power for another 12 years. He'll just sit there and wait, and he'll launch another attack 5 years from now, 8 years from now. There's literally nothing preventing him from doing that. So I understand, it looks like a good idea to advocate for that, for some diplomatic solution, but there's, then we're going to be here again, I think, in the future. And we need to really consider something more dramatic. And as far as, Putin being removed and everything, I understand that that's not something that Russians are going to do themselves. And I certainly don't advocate for some kind of external intervention. I think that's far too risky. Obviously, overthrowing somebody else's government is not a good idea. That's going to create the opposite thing that we want. It would, I think, indicate, or I think it would, there would be a kind of rally around the flag where Russians would come out to support that, whoever took Putin's place. That guy could be worse than Putin. There's a lot of reasons not to do that. Unfortunately, I don't really know, how Russia gets out of this with Putin still in power, just kind of given the promises that he's made. And just to go back to this NATO expansion, so I want to just give a little bit more historical context. So obviously this whole idea was that NATO promised Russia in the post-Soviet world order that NATO would not expand. Russia also promised that they would respect the sovereignty of the countries that had become independent. We can criticize NATO as long as we want for doing the expansion that they said they would not do, but we have to equally criticize Russia for invading several countries in that time period as well, and also not respecting that order. Ukraine also gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 in exchange for a security guarantee from the US, the UK, and Russia that its territorial sovereignty would not be violated. And its territorial sovereignty has been violated by Russia, one of the participants in that agreement. So I think it's too one-sided to criticize NATO without criticizing Russia over the past 20 years for doing many of the things that they promised that they would not do, and not just in Ukraine and not just in Georgia, but in Chechnya and in various Central Asian countries. Russia has a very strong interventionist attitude in a lot of the formerly Soviet countries. That's also unacceptable. Now, like you said, obviously, worst case scenario is nuclear war. I'm teaching this summer, and my last class yesterday, we spent about an hour trying to figure out if that is really likely or not. We didn't agree. Some of the students said that, Putin is really too fearful of it and wouldn't actually do something. He's the one who's afraid of being annihilated, right? Here in the US, we don't really think it's that likely. Whereas Vladimir Putin wakes up every day thankful that he has not, had a nuke dropped on him, right? So I don't know. We've talked a lot about and people who I've been speaking with, I've looked a lot at this kind of smaller tactical nuclear strikes, like a more targeted nuclear strike, as something that would be, something that could do a lot of damage, but perhaps wouldn't provoke NATO intervention, right? Like there's another step between where we are now and all-out nuclear war before we get there. I hope we don't get there at all, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. Unfortunately, I think we have to be realistic about that.
Anyone else have a question?
I have a question.
Uh-oh.
Hello.
Hi.
This is Mike Hager here, and I appreciate the professor's comments. I think emotionally, I share a lot of those views emotionally, but in my head, I agree with Calso. I think he's absolutely right about the dangers of having this go to stalemate and trying to get the US to continue to supply weapons indefinitely. I think that's no answer. I don't think the American people, as you indicated about the Europeans, where their support is starting to wane, I think the US support will wane too, because the media focus will be on other matters. One issue that hasn't been raised is the effects outside of Ukraine. And I think the major effect that I see, and it's a looming disaster, is what the lack of grain is doing in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. I've lived in Egypt, and I know what the difference of a few piastres for bread can mean for these poor families. And so the prospect of mass starvation, migration coming up ahead, I don't know if the world can support a sustained effort in Ukraine. The last point in terms of the effects of this continual arming, and I must say I was not opposed to the initial self-defense of the country's capital. But I think to enter into a prolonged war in a continuing war in the Donbass region is a disaster. And I think and I don't think, based on everything I've read about it, the Ukrainians can be expected, as valiant as they are, to push the Russians back into Russia. That's not going to happen except by an agreement, by diplomacy. And I think that the diplomacy is something that needs intervention by third parties, but not the US. I don't think the US has the credibility to deal on this issue. I think it needs to be another country, and there needs to be real mediation techniques that will lead to a solution. Now, of course, Russia can't be trusted. I agree with that. But there are ways to enforce that. And I think in terms of guarantees, I think the risk of nuclear war is being underestimated. These so-called strategic tactical weapons, I'm told by nuclear experts, are the equivalent of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're not little bunker blasts. They are really devastating. I think my own view, and it's only a speculation, is that there's a good chance that if that happens, if there's such an attack on Ukraine by Russia, that the US would, given its past record, would be inclined to make a preemptive strike. And Biden has already taken the notion of a nuclear attack preemptively off the table. And so both Russia and the US have indicated that nuclear war is not unforeseeable, that it could happen. So I think given the interest beyond Ukraine, both in terms of the poverty and lack of food for peoples around the world, and also the possibility, which is not de minimis, of having a nuclear war, means that diplomacy must be tried. Ultimately, it will have to be tried, because ultimately there's no way the war will end anytime, whether it's 2 years or 20 years, without some kind of an agreement that will have all the problems that the professor mentions, but that there's no other way around it. And devices have to be found to guarantee that agreements made in a settlement will be kept. For example, the agreement to stop the war would be accompanied by the requirement that Russia takes its troops out beyond any part that hasn't been agreed to in terms of a territorial concession. That's all I have to say, and I apologize for the length of the response.
How do we make a comment? Steve Farrell? How do I work my Zoom control? This is sort of new to me.
On the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a chat, and there should also be reactions.
I see
those?
chat, yes, and
Okay.
I see reactions,
Yeah,
yes.
so reactions are if you want to raise your hand,
Okay,
I'm calling you, or if you just want to write your question in the chat.
well, I raised my hand.
All right, so you'll be next, but let's
Sure,
let the
sure.
doctor answer.
Sure, thank you,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, well, it wasn't much of a question there, so I'll just say, yes, this grain crisis is certainly something that many of us are really concerned about. I just would, reframe it a little. This is a grain crisis being caused by Russia's forcible blockading of Ukrainian ports. Russian troops have been stealing and destroying Ukrainian grain. They've been specifically targeting Ukrainian agricultural production, in order to make it worse. This is something that isn't just going to be unfolding in the next 6 months. It will be years, just because Ukraine is such an important producer of grain for the world. Russia has also, there's been some evidence that BBC did a really excellent investigation of where Ukrainian grain is going. A lot of it's coming out through occupied Crimea. So basically Russia is using the territory that it already took over to create a stranglehold on the rest of the world. And Putin is using this. He's now having diplomatic meetings with leaders of African countries that are most affected by not having access to grain. So, to me, that tells me that he's using this as leverage to try to get more support of countries outside of Europe try to tip the scales a little bit more. And again, to me, this is him, Russia being a bad actor and a bad faith actor. I think at a certain point you can't reward that by saying, okay, we'll treat you as an equal diplomatic partner. I don't think that's fair. And I certainly don't think that's fair to Ukraine, who has, borne the brunt of the violence and continues to do the bulk of the fighting as well.
Stephen, did you want to ask your question now?
Sure. I just had two quick points. One, the first one is the quickest. I wonder if the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine were never removed, were there, would this have all happened at all? Would Putin have decided to attack, knowing that all these nuclear weapons are on the other side? That was a quick thought. I think perhaps equally important, more importantly, I studied the matter a little, a limited knowledge, but the economic side of why Putin wants Eastern Ukraine and Northeastern Ukraine with the gas fields and the alternatives that are currently under study to change the distribution of the gas fields such that Russia's economic engine would be considerably shut down, and there are plans underway. It appears to me that those plans could take 10 to 20 years, perhaps. And in that 10 to 20 years, the Ukrainians will run out of people. And that's kind of my concern. So if a negotiated settlement comes about, it would appear to me that the interest of the Russians in getting their gas out and getting the food they need for themselves and their country is part of the deal. And I think I agree that maybe the United States shouldn't be the ones negotiating that, but who is it? And that's my question.
Yeah, I think the question of if Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons in 1994, it's an interesting. So I was just rereading about this, and the thing that's most interesting is that despite a lot of Ukrainian political leaders at that time in the 90s understanding how risky it was to give up those nuclear weapons, it was not popular to keep them in Ukraine. So there was no public support and no political support for keeping them. So even if they had wanted to, it really seems unlikely that they would have been able to do that. And of course, the United States and its allies are also pushing for denuclearization and non-proliferation, right? So everything goes against Ukraine in 1994 to push them into that position, to the point that there wasn't really any other option, despite the fact that many of the people who negotiated that deal in retrospect have said that it was actually not a good deal for Ukraine, and they absolutely regret forcing Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. That's possibly the only thing that could have changed Russia's calculation right now. They, certainly that changes how they're thinking. And then in terms of that question of who is there to negotiate, as a third party, I think honestly, I do not know who is trusted enough by both sides. Maybe Turkey sits somewhere in the middle. That would be basically my only suggestion. I think that's the only option.
And the alternative routing of the gas fields.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine is home to most of the transportation pipelines for Russian gas that has to get to the European Union. That's been a political tool for Ukraine since independence, basically. I mean, certainly, I didn't really think that control over those pipelines was a motivation for Russia to invade. That seemed kind of silly to me, because it seemed to be working fine to just sort of hold that political tool over Ukraine. We'll turn off the gas if you don't give us what we want. They've been doing that for 30 years. So I don't know. And also just to point out that those gas pipelines are pretty old. That technology is old, and Russia doesn't necessarily, I mean, I guess they're going to have it now, but they're going to be responsible for updating that technology at some point, and it's going to cost them a lot of money. So that calculation just sort of doesn't, I don't get it. I mean, I don't think that it's not true. Like, I don't think that it's not part of their thinking. It sort of seems like a sort of I don't know, they were in a fine place before, that's not motivation enough to change
Yeah.
anything. But the invasion also didn't make any sense to me in the first place. It seemed like a bad choice in the first place. So,
Thank you, Doctor.
yeah, thank you.
Carlson was next and then Igor. So we'll go to Carlson. Carlson, did you have a question?
Yes, just as a correction, I said before, it's Carlos Molina.
Oh, Carlos. Okay.
Sorry, my fault if it's appearing differently. Couple of things, Dr. Justice. I take real issue with saying that you think that Putin is afraid of nuclear war. Only because nobody knows what's in Putin's mind and brain. We keep hearing this all the time. Number two, I want to reiterate what Mike said earlier, and the last speaker said. He made a comment about running out of people. That's the concern, not just running out of people for, to deal with the gas pipe, the gas lines, but also running out of people and decimation of Ukraine. And I'm also and you, Dr. Cummings, you made an interesting comment, which I'm concerned with, because I think that a lot of people think this. They'll say, well, Putin is a bad actor. We shouldn't reward bad actors. Putin is a horrible, horrible human being. Nevertheless, why are we talking about that and dealing with that when millions and millions of lives? I'll deal with a bad actor. I'll do whatever has to be done to save millions and millions of lives. So I think part of the issue of the mentality of the US is that comment that he's a bad actor, we can't reward them. So let him annihilate millions and millions of Ukraine. I take the opposite position. Let's deal with bad actors, figure it out, and whatever it takes, and stop the killing and dying of millions of Ukrainians. And yes, it should not be the US, anybody but. And another comment that you made about that we shouldn't overthrow governments. Well, maybe that's the reason why the US shouldn't be involved in this, because I can give you a list of governments that have been overthrown by the support and work of the US. Thank you.
I certainly respect your opinion. I think that the key counterpoint to that is millions of Ukrainians don't agree that it's remotely feasible to work with Putin, and that's who it's up to, right? So that sort of leaves us in a position where, so what, what's the next step forward? Do you force people who disagree with the idea of finding a diplomatic solution? How do you force them to accept that diplomatic solution once you put it into place if you haven't taken their perspective into account? I think it's a really open question, and it's a difficult one. I understand that. But like I said before, Ukrainian public opinion does not support concession of territory for a diplomatic peaceful solution. It does not, and that isn't changing right now. That was a public opinion poll that was done last week.
Next up was Igor Kowal. Igor, are you there?
You can't take over.
All right, well,
Can you hear me now?
yes. Hi, Igor.
Hi, I'm a Ukrainian American. I was born in England. My parents were refugees after the Second World War. I also spent 10 years working in Ukraine for a Western multinational company. So, and I know Ukraine very well, from the west to eastern Ukraine, where the fighting is going on. I just find it strange that Americans, particularly the first two speakers, are saying we should just give up. We shouldn't, because millions of people will be killed. And for Ukrainians will not give up. I can tell you that they will not give up. A neighbor came to me a couple of weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, says, "What do you think will happen?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I hope there is not a war, but I do know that the president of Ukraine will not run like the Afghanistani president ran and the army collapsed. And we have seen this for 4 months now. Ukraine has been battling against all odds. I have my cousin's grandson was killed a week ago fighting near Kharkiv. He was a volunteer. He was working with drones. There's many Ukrainians like that. Half of Ukraine is fighting, the other half are volunteering. And I take it as an insult to Ukrainians to give up, to make some kind of peace with Putin. You cannot make peace with terrorists and people like that. End of story. I'm not sure what nationality Carlos Molina is, but he would never say that about his own country, to give up. And thank you, Emily, for as an American, no Ukrainian blood in you, for putting these people right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's the key point that I'm, trying to get across here is certainly, like you've said, and like I said already, Ukrainians are not at this point willing to accept territorial concessions in any circumstance. And if the US is not going to be the diplomatic partner, then, there's really no further discussion of that.
Did someone just have their hand raised?
You can't take over.
Stephen?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, so just listening to this and Ihor's last remarks and the comments about maybe the United States isn't the right negotiator. I don't think the United States categorically is going to let Ukraine in totality be removed from the planet. With that said, I just don't think that's going to happen. Other things will happen long before that. Tell me, Doctor, your comment about keeping the war in Ukraine in the minds of people. Thoughts about ways to go about that. I've been working with Ukraine Forward, and we have a couple of initiatives here in Massachusetts, and I know Ihor has done a lot of work in Concord. So in trying to get that going in South Shore, Boston, it was my finding that the interest is waning significantly because of all of the other things that taking up people's time. And then we're not going to make a list of those. But so how can the Ukrainian American organizations like yours and the Education Center in Boston and so on, and organizations like you throughout the country work to keep the matter in the fore, the press, our free press, our social media. There seems to me to be a huge need for campaigns to tell the kinds of stories where someone can tell a story that's to a public audience, that, like Ihor just told, of losing a relative such as he did. And I have heard many of these stories. So how does that happen? How do we keep it in the fore?
Yeah, this is a big conundrum. I think obviously, especially in the US, it's really difficult. We get distracted by domestic issues, which is understandable, and we have a lot to be concerned about. I think sort of shifting some of the mechanisms of storytelling can be helpful. So, reminding people that this is still happening. I mean, I'm curious to see what happens in Europe as well. As there's still Ukrainian refugees all over the continent. So it's a question of whether or not a lot of these support systems will continue. And I know a few people who are working on this kind of trying to focus, like projects that are focusing more on people's personal stories, so that instead of telling the same story over and over again, we're hearing kind of more individual accounts that can resonate with each of us in different ways. So I think that's an interesting tactic. In the US, one thing I'm kind of hoping, so obviously the US response to get refugees to the US has been, I wouldn't say necessarily delayed, but like I mentioned, a lot of people ended up in Europe first and have only now started to come to the US. And so I hope that many Ukrainian refugees, I hope that more people will meet Ukrainian refugees and will hear some of their stories and will understand, precisely what they've given up, and might be, more inclined to continue to think about Ukraine if they, people, I think that's often something that happens, something that resonates with us personally makes us care a little bit more. So I think that, I mean, continuing to, use social media to follow people who are reporting. I would say that a lot of the mainstream news sources are, at least print things and things that are, websites, that sort of thing, are still doing a fair job of covering, are doing a fair job of covering what's still going on. Although again, on most of those, the coverage starts much further down the page than it used to. So I think, sharing those stories with people that we know, pointing them to good resources, that's always really helpful. But this is something I'm still thinking about too. I don't know exactly the answer to this. I'm lucky this summer that I'm teaching and I have a room full of students all the time who are thinking about it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're gonna end it because we're just over an hour. If people have any further questions, you can always shoot me an email, which is it's racine.oxtoby@wellfleet-ma.gov. You can also find that on the contact page on the Wellfleet library, and I'd be happy to forward it to Dr. Channell Justice if there's anything you'd like to get to her. But I want to thank her for being here this evening, for taking time out of her day and her summer school schedule to be here with us. And thank you all who tuned in and were a part of this Zoom chat.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you. Everyone have a good evening. And and tell your friends if they missed this. This will be on the Wellfleet Library website. If not tomorrow, definitely by Friday. We'll post the link.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.